Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the SciFlow 1000 Fluidic System webinar. Can someone please use the question box to let me know if you can hear me? The question box is right there. Great, you can hear me. I really appreciate that. My name is Steve Close. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for SciKon's Innovation. We're going to talk today about the SciFlow 1000 Fluidic Culture System. I'll be doing the presentation with Dave Sloan, and he is our Director of Scientific Operations. Anytime during the webinar you have a question, please don't hesitate to put a question in the question box. We're going to be stopping periodically the webinar to answer your questions. I want to first start off with giving a little bit of background with SciKon. It was founded by Dr. Randy McClellan. Randy has an extensive background with bioreactors and cells. The company was established in 2009. We almost doubled in size based on revenue in 2015. We sell primarily into the pharmaceutical, ag chem, consumer product, and chemical industries. We also had a successful round of funding in 2015. What we do as a company, we'll be talking today about the SciFlow 1000. We also develop custom tools. We have a skin and tissue procurement business along with media. And also we have a CRO services division of our company. I want to back up here a little bit, try to frame our conversation a little bit with regard to drug discovery. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but I just wanted to make sure to go over the importance of tools early on in the process. There's a lot of time and effort and money that goes into the drug development pipeline. There's tens of thousands of compounds that go on one side. Not a lot comes out on the other side. Failures in the funnel can be very costly to companies. We're based in RTP, North Carolina, and there's a lot of small biotech companies here, and we see it from time to time. When you have a failure of a drug in phase 2 or phase 3, it can be really catastrophic. So it's important to get it right, especially when it comes to toxicology and efficacy. The challenge is a lot of the in vitro tools these days don't meet the needs. Animals are expensive, they're costly. There's definitely a need in the market for more predictive in vitro systems, and fluidics are becoming more and more prevalent. This is what we're going to talk about today. It's the SciFlow 1000 Fluidic Culture System. Some of the things that we hear when we introduce this product to our customers are increased cell health and viability, biological relevance, the ability to tie different organ systems together. Probably one of the biggest things is the simplicity of the system itself. We were at SOT 3 weeks ago, and a lot of people asked the question, well, you really don't have any pumps or tubing or anything like that, and so it is a very simple system that's compatible with a lot of your existing equipment, whether it be LCMS or plate readers, or it's a standard 96 well format. And so one of the things I want you to take away is it's a very simple system. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Sloan, and he's going to do the rest of the presentation, and I'm going to pick up on the back end of the presentation with a couple business slides.
Good day, everybody. Thanks for coming. Give me 1 second to get myself situated here. Okay, thank you. Looks like we have a good crowd here. I'm excited about this. Okay, the SciFlow 1000. SciFlow 1000. So Steve set the scene nicely for some of the advantages, some of the feedback we get from our customers. I'm going to go a bit deeper on all these topics. I'm going to explain the technology, then I'm going to dive into the data and explain some of the data that we've generated and tell some of the stories of what our customers are doing with the system. As Steve mentioned, if you have any questions, please type them into the questions log. I will probably wait and batch some questions at some various time points in the talk, but if I see a question pop up there that's related exactly to a slide, I'll try to grab it at that point as well. So please don't hesitate to ask. There's three main areas we're going to focus on. There's biological relevance, compatibility, and data rich. From a biological relevance standpoint, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. One of the main ways is gradients. The SciFlow system is a fluidic system, which is very different than a static system. We see gradients of drug or compound, we see gradients of metabolites, we see gradients of cellular responses or cell signaling as it goes across the plate. That's a much more biologically relevant way of sending messages or exposing cells to a compound. It doesn't go from 0 to 100%, it slowly increases as it reaches an equilibrium. We also, I just want to throw it out there right now, we're able to put different cell types within an interconnected fluid row. So we are able to have drugs or compounds that will passage through, let's say, an oral administration route going from intestine to liver to, say, heart or kidney or some other organ downstream, looking at absorption, processivity, and then toxicity way downstream. Compatibility, the system is an SDS compliant 96 well plate. Works with plate readers, it works with high content imagers, it works with the assays and dyes you're already running in your lab. I'll get to this data set closer to the end of the talk. I just want to set the idea that all the data, this is a time course across the plate, all this data comes from one row of one SciFlow plate. So you can really do a very thorough and comprehensive study with not a lot of plates, which means you don't need a lot of cells, you don't need a lot of drug, you don't need a lot of media. You save a lot of materials by using the SciFlow system. Working with cells. At the heart of the system, it is a tissue culture plate. You can culture cells in there. You can visualize the cells that you've cultured in there. This is a screenshot out of our product inserts. We frequently get asked, how many cells do I need? How much media do I need? How many different cell types have you looked at? This is a rather liver or hepatocyte focused list of cells, but we've done other types of cells as well. We've not only done liver, we've also done some cancer cells, we've done some lung cancer cells, we've done some primary human, we've done some other types of cells as well. So the list is constantly increasing, but this is a slightly liver focused list. I also want to mention that our plate is a half area 96 well plate. So if you're using half area 96 well plates, it'll be the same amount of cells. If you're using standard 96 well plates, you'll use about half the number of cells in the SciFlow plate as you use in your other full-size 96 well system. Some pictures. These pictures are of cells that are captured directly in the SciFlow plate. It's a standard inversion microscope that we have in the lab, so there's nothing magical or special about it. Some various hepatocytes from some non-human species, some stromal cells that we looked at. Cells look happy, cells look like they're dividing normally, cells are proliferating. Human cells, again, human hepatocytes, some breast cancer cells as well. Cells are stacking on each other. And the cells are developing as you'd expect them to develop, but fluidics do give us a little bit more metabolic activity, a little bit more cell health than you see in a standard static system. HEPA-RG, we're just completing a project for a DILI or a drug-induced liver injury-focused consortium in Europe. They wanted us to work with HEPA-RG cells. This is the 10-day time course of the differentiation of the HEPA-RG cells, again, directly in the SciFlow plate in the standard inversion microscope. If anyone on the call isn't really familiar with HEPA-RGs, they are an immortalized liver cell line. It's not just liver. There's also some canalicular cells that are present in there as well. They're the small cells that you kind of see accumulating in there. But this is what the cells look like. It's not that the cells are looking unhealthy. This is just what the HEPA-RG cells look like over time. This goes out a couple more days, 11, 15, 18. It's 24-day that we cultured the cells for, which is nice. It gives us a longer-term drug study. It gives us a longer-term ability to dose the cells or dose the cells with drug to see the long-term effects. This is some cell titer glow data. It's a Promega kit. If anyone's unfamiliar with cell titer glow, I'm going to show a bunch of cell titer glow data later on. It measures ATP, so it's either a surrogate for how healthy and metabolically active the cells are or just total cell number. So I'm showing across on this graph day 11 through day 24 of the HEPA-RG cells in the SciFlow plate, and we're seeing pretty uniform, pretty stable numbers of cell titer glow or ATP. There is this small dip at about day 18. That's a pretty reproducible dip in 18. I think it's something to do with the differentiation of the cell types. You can see the cells look a little bit smaller as you go from day 15 to 18, but then it somewhat recovers at day 24, and that's pretty standard with what we see when we're culturing these various cells. So really the take-home message is we can culture cells, we can visualize the cells, you can work cells in the same way you've always worked the cells in a static plate, just getting a lot of the benefits of the fluidics of the SciFlow system. Technology. I'm going to turn over to the technology now to give you a little bit of a basis of how the fluidics work. This is a picture of the plate on the right side, and what we see is it's this user-friendly solution. It's all there, it's all ready, it's all set to go. There's nothing you need to do. It's sterile and ready to use out of the box. There is some complex design work that went into it. There was some material science, there was some fluid science, there was some fluid mechanics that had to go into getting the system so that it would flow in a very reproducible and user-friendly fashion. The nice thing is, the benefit is, we put it together, we put all the engineering in there so that our users can focus on the biology. Our users don't need to worry about how it works. They just know that it does work and that it's going to reproducibly flow across the plate every time in the same fashion. I got a question. Question says, how do these cultures compare to conventional cultures? I'm not sure I totally understand the question. If the person who typed in that question can maybe give a little bit additional clarification, that'd be great. I will happily address that question. If you're talking about volumes, the volume of the cultures is about 100 microliters. If you're talking about the number of cells we use is pretty similar to a half area 96 well plate. If you're talking about cell viability, we generally see at least as good viability as you'd see with a static system, though we have some data with primary hepatocytes again, but with primary hepatocytes where we are seeing slightly longer viability and we are seeing slightly more metabolic activity in those cells. Okay, I got it. Thank you. I will come back to it. Engineering, the user-friendly solution that's ready to go. How does the flow work? So at the most simple level, at the most basic level, it is a shallow waterfall or a river. So what we have is the bottom of each of the wells cascades downward, and it's the height of the bottom of the wells that drives the flow. As Steve mentioned, there is no pumps, there is no tubing, there is no fluidics that's required for the flow to occur. It's a gravity-driven fluidic system, and it is ready to use out of the box. This is a side view of the SciFlow plate. One row, one interconnected row has been filled with a purple or colored liquid so that you can see the height differential in the bottom of each well as you go from left to right across the plate. This height differential is 0.5 millimeter. So there's a 0.5 millimeter or 500 micron step from column 2 to column 3, column 3 to column 4, column 4 to column 5, all the way across the plate. It is this change in height that drives the flow across the plate. There's nothing else that needs to be done to make the system flow. Once the wells are filled to about 100 microliters and the source well is filled with media, flow will begin. I'll get to the specifics of the flow and how quick the flow is in a couple of slides. Just want to drive home the point at this point that all that's required is liquid in the wells, and then the flow will begin. I also want to mention that it's an entirely polystyrene material, a tissue culture treated polystyrene. So if people have worked with other fluidic systems that were made of different materials that maybe had some tubing or connectors and were concerned about loss of compound or loss of drug or loss of metabolites to the material, you don't need to worry about it in the SciFlow system. It's the same material that you're currently using in all of your tissue culture studies. Gradients. I mentioned gradients as one of the real big positives or benefits of the SciFlow system. Top-down view of one row of the plate. On the left side is the source well where you dose. This is a larger well, so you can put a larger volume of liquid in here. On the right side is the sink or the waste, where you get coalesced material and responses all the way at the right side, but I've cut it off from this picture, but there is a source or waste all the way on the right side. And what you see is very reliable, very reproducible flow from left to right across the plate. This is a simple example where I just had bromophenol blue in all of the wells, and I dosed with acid. So I added acid to my source well. So what we're looking at in terms of this gradient is we're looking at a pH gradient across the plate. Because I'm dosing acid, the acid is flowing across the plate and changing the indicator from the purple, which is the basic color, to the yellow, which is the acidic color. And it's basically identifying the concentration gradient of compounds that you'd see across the plate. The two gradients that we see test compound, which we're constantly dosing only into the source well. It will decrease across the plate, both based on dilution as it flows, as well as based upon cellular metabolism as it's going through each of these wells. Also, what we'll see is a metabolite gradient, and we'll see an inverted metabolite gradient because the metabolites are produced upstream, but as it's flowing, what we'll see is the metabolites also flowing downstream. So we'll get an inverted metabolite gradient with higher concentrations on the right and lower concentrations on the left. What this allows us to do, and the data will speak to this later, but what this allows us to do is isolate the effects. We can see differences in responses based on whether it's a primary compound effect or a downstream metabolite effect, which is causing the effect on the cell. So it gives us the ability to get some mechanistic information about how the drug or compound is working on top of the different concentration gradients that we're seeing across the plate. How does the plate work? So there's 8 rows on the plate. Frequently, we'll reserve a couple of rows within the plate for a fluidic tracer so we can trace the flow and track the flow and understand how the flow is going. But other than that, we have 6 different rows on the plate. If you're running duplicates, you could look at 3 different compounds or drugs within one run on the plate. If you wanted to have 3 different starting concentrations of drugs, you could have 3 different starting concentrations within a plate. If you wanted to have treated and DMSO or vehicle control, so a lot of things you can do on a plate to get a whole self-contained study within one plate, all with the controls and the experimental all together to maximize the amount of information that you get from one run. Workflow. How does the workflow go on the system? It's a real straightforward workflow. Once the cells are seated in each well, you no longer need to interact within each well of the plate. When you want to feed or dose or get fresh media in there, it's just 2 steps. You remove a volume of media from the waste or the last column on the plate. You then add a volume of media or drug to the source well, and the flow will resume. That's all you have to do to feed. The flow will resume until an equilibrium is reached, and then the cells will sit there. The cells will wait with the media present, with the drug present. They'll do their metabolizing, they'll do their responses, and the media will sit there until you start the flow again by feeding the plate again, by removing from the last and dosing in the source well. We frequently get asked, how often do I have to dose? It's up to the user. It's up to what you're hoping to accomplish from the experiment. We've done dosing or feeding as frequently as 3 times a day. We've done it as infrequently as every other day. So we can mimic static cultures with a 48-hour dosing, or we can dose more regularly without worrying about killing our cells, even though most cells don't like static or total media changes multiple times a day, but we don't see that problem with our fluidic system. We can dose more frequently if we wish to. Exposure. Speaking about dosing, speaking about exposure, it's a different method. There's different types of information that you get out of the SciFlow system. Before I dive into exposure, I'm going to pause for a moment just to see if anybody has any questions on how the fluidics with the system work, how the system flows, how you handle the plate. Okay, one more question has popped up. The question is, do you really not need any pumps or tubing, or are you just not showing it on the slides? I appreciate the question. I take no offense at the question, and the answer is correct. There is really no pumps or tubing required. The pictures that we're showing is all that you need. There is a lid that you can put on the plate as well. We leave the lid on there for cleanliness and sterility purposes. You do need to lift the lid off when you want to feed the cells, but other than that, everything is pictured. There is nothing else that you need to do to get it moving, to get it going, to get the whole system running appropriately. There are no pumps or tubing or other material. Another question popped up. What is the time of the flow to the last well or to the last well? That's a great question. I'm going to address that in a slide or two. What I will say is that when you dose, it takes roughly about an hour to 90 minutes for the volumes to equilibrate and the flow to pause or go down to really just a trickle of flow. But what volume you dose with will also determine how far the dose reaches. And it will take 2 or 3 doses to really push a significant amount of drug or compound down to the end of the plate or the last wells on the plate. So you do see a relatively steep gradient from left to right of concentration across the plate. One more question. Oh, a great question. Oxygen gradients. That's something we're currently looking at. I fully expect that there may be oxygen gradients across the plate, but we have not yet investigated it. Well, actually, I'm going to change my mind. I'm not sure there'll be oxygen gradients across the plate. What I meant to say is I fully expect that there will be differences in oxygenation between a SciFlow plate and a static plate. Whether there'll be oxygen gradients across the plate still needs to be investigated. But that's a great question, and if that's something you routinely do, I might want to talk about that with you offline. I'm not going to say people's names. Questions are anonymous, but the person who asked the oxygen question, I will reach out to you later if you want to discuss that in more detail. Exposure. Coming back over to exposure. There's 2 schools of thought with exposure. There's a static world and there's the fluidic world. In the static world, the concentration of drug or compound goes from 0 to 100% as soon as you dose the well. As soon as you add the drug, it's at full concentration, and the drug or compound sits at that concentration through the whole course of the experiment. This is, of course, not taking into account any cellular metabolism. If there is cellular metabolism, you'll get a sawtooth-like graph where it'll decrease with the metabolism, and then as soon as you redose, it'll shoot back up to 100%, and then potentially decrease or shoot back up to 100% based on the cell's ability to metabolize. And if you're doing serial dilutions, if you're manually diluting things, you can interrogate different concentrations, but they're all going to be static, fixed, flat doses. SciFlow looks very different. This is a SciFlow dosing concentration graph. I'm showing 3 different curves from 3 different wells. I'm showing one curve in blue from well 3, which is close to the source well, in red from well 7, which is the middle of the plate, and in green from well 10, which is all the way near the waste well in the plate. And what you can see close to the source, we get a very steep concentration increase over days or over doses, so it finally reaches an equilibrium and stays there for the rest of the experiment. Middle of the plate is a more linear dosing scheme, and the end of the plate, column 10, has a longer lag phase before it finally does start trickling up multiple days, multiple doses. This also addresses what is the time of flow till you reach the last well. So what you can see here in column 10, or in the green line, this is dosing once a day, and this is days. So you don't see any appreciable concentration at the first dose. You see a very small concentration at the second dose. By about the 3rd dose, you're starting to see significant concentrations of material accumulating in that last well on the plate. The important take-home message is the concentration is dynamic over the course of the experiment. It changes over time until the equilibrium is reached. It is tunable. It is tunable by tuning how frequently you dose and what volume you dose with. And the concentration is measured. It's not fixed. You measure it either with a fluidic tracer or with mass spec for determining the concentration present in each well. But it's a biologically relevant dosing. This looks much more like an in vivo plasma drug concentration than the static dosing scheme does. To dive a little bit deeper, just to make sure people understand how the dosing and the exposure works, this is a cartoon of the plate. What I'm doing is I'm highlighting well 3, or column 3 in this case, and you can see at day 2 it's got a relatively high concentration, and then as you dose once a day, 2 more doses later, day 4, and then day 8, it's really reaching its maximum concentration and staying at that same concentration for the course of the experiment. To jump downstream to column 7, well 7, there's a hint on day 2, and then it's increasing linearly to day 4, and then day 8, until it does come close to the same final concentration that you saw in the upstream well, but it took much longer to get there. Finally, at the end of the plate, column 10, there's a longer lag phase where you see a lot less material till it finally starts creeping up as you get into day 5, 6, 8, and all the way out at day 10. So the exposure in the SciFlow system is not as simple as a static 100 micromolar or 1 millimolar or whatever it may be for X numbers of days. It's a dynamically changing concentration, which is much more similar to what a cell would see in a body or an organ or tissue would see within a body. One or two more slides to go through dosing. Each well is a mini time-resolved concentration study. So this is, again, drug concentration over time within each well of one row of the plate. You can see it's steepest on the left, shallowest on the right. If you wanted to determine or ask what is the total exposure of drug or the total burden of drug seen in each well, what we do is we sum all of the individual exposures at the time points that we looked at to get a cumulative exposure of drug within each well of the plate. And while the final concentration at the end of the experiment isn't so different between all of the wells, the cumulative exposure is really pretty different in terms of the total concentration seen of drug within each well. And if you were to graph it, one very novel effect that we see is we do see the same cumulative exposure in different wells of the plate, just at different time points. So in the upstream wells, it may take 2 days to reach the cumulative exposure of, let's say, 1.5, whereas in the downstream wells in column 10 or 11, it may take 7 days to reach that same exposure, that same concentration. So you can also ask, is there a time effect in terms of the dose that the cells see? Is more rapid dosing more detrimental? Is slower dosing more detrimental? Are there different effects across the time course of that one dosing experiment? And all of this data comes from one row of one SciFlow plate. Fluidic performance. Fluorescein tracer, we've done a lot of work with a fluorescein tracer just because it's very easy to track fluorescence in a plate reader, and our plate does fit in standard plate readers. So what I'm showing here is a 90-minute time course where I put one dose of fluorescein. This is, of course, blue dye, so you can see it, but I put one dose of fluorescein in there, and you can see in the upstream wells in column 3, there's a very rapid burst phase as the flow is occurring very rapidly over about 15 or 20 minutes. And then it slows down to more of a trickle for the rest of about the 90 minutes or 2 hours that it flows. You can see downstream, the flow continues a little bit farther as it's still trickling. You can see it. And then column 9, you can see a very small or hint of signal that's appearing in column 9 over this 90 minutes or so that we're flowing. So how does the flow really work? There's a burst phase where there's rapid flow for about 15 or 20 minutes. Then there's a slower 90 minutes. And then there's really just a diffusion-limited process for flow that will continue until you redose or add more media to the source well. There is a wick or a siphon in the waste well as well, so that will also draw a little bit of fluid across, but the majority of the flow happens within this first roughly 2-hour period, and then the cells are sitting with the same media, with the same drug, and allowed to respond to the drug to have its effect, for the cells to be absorbing and metabolizing and processing that drug. So that's where you can start monitoring your effects of what your dose has done in those wells. Dosing schedules, I mentioned it's tunable. I mentioned that the user can change the dose based on what they're trying to accomplish. There's 2 main variables, the frequency, and that's either multiple times a day or every other day or anywhere in between. The volume, how much liquid you want to add to the source well and remove from the sink. And it can go anywhere from about 50 microliters on the low end of the dosing to about 200 microliters on the higher end of the dosing. So there's quite a range in acceptable volumes, a range in times, and by playing with those ranges and times, it really does affect the outcome. More doses or higher volumes of doses does push the equilibrium much quicker, and there's a much smaller difference in final concentrations between the upstream and downstream wells. Less frequent doses or lower volumes give you a higher or larger concentration gradient across the plate. And these types of experiments are useful For drugs that perhaps have a lower clearance, you might want to flow more slowly. For drugs with a higher clearance, you might want to push it more quickly so that you can separate out the drug and the metabolite effects. The system really is flexible and tailorable to the science that you're trying to accomplish. Some applications for the system, like I mentioned, we have a lot of data on liver. We've been slightly liver focused. I'm going to show some data that has some compound or primary effects with concentration gradient. I'm going to show some acetaminophen data that has some metabolite effects or metabolite gradient effects within the liver cells that we're looking at. And I'm going to show one example of a multi-organ system where we're looking at bioactivation of chemotherapeutics, and we have liver cells upstream of cancer cells, and we're looking at the ability of the liver cells to bioactivate the various chemotherapeutics, and then we're looking at the effects on those downstream liver cells. But I want to stress the point that while we may not have tried your exact application area, it's a flexible tool, it's adaptable to many different areas of research, and there's a lot of different things that you can do with the system. I'm now going to pause just for 1 minute in case there's any other questions that people have. Actually, I'll say one more thing. I want to mention the drugs that were used. Aflatoxin was used in the compound testing. Acetaminophen, APAP, was used in the metabolite effects, and this is a 7-drug panel. And this material is also contained on a couple of posters that we have available that we presented at SOT last week. So I'm going to pause for 1 moment. I'm going to take a sip of the beverage. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in. Super. We have one more question. How are the concentrations measured? That's a great question. There's 2 ways that the concentrations can be measured. The concentrations can be extrapolated from the flow of fluorescein. So we usually include a fluorescein tracer. We use that for extrapolating idealized concentrations, exactly analogous to what you'd have in a static plate. We know how far the fluorescein has flowed. We know the starting concentration of fluorescein, so we can measure the dilution effect across the plate and extrapolate that to the drugs that we're testing with. If we want to include metabolism, it's analogous to how you do it on a static plate. You can do mass spec. So the plate is open, all of the wells are accessible. You can sample out of the wells at any point in the experiment without disrupting the gradient. When you sample out of the plate, you can take 10 or 15 microliters, take it aside for a mass spec experiment, and you can do mass spec on the supernatants, and that's how you would be determining the actual concentration of drug, incorporating metabolism into the equation. And we've done it both ways, and we do it both ways. There's a question about viability and metabolic capacity based on the flow. We've done some preliminary studies on it. We've seen nice effects. We've looked at a lot of the CYP enzymes, or at least a couple of the CYP enzymes, and we do see high metabolic activity, at least in the HEPA RG cells that we were looking at, and it is maintained through the course of the experiment. We've looked at a couple of other markers as well of cell health. We looked at GSH because it's an easily measured marker. We do see high levels of GSH maintained across the plate, and we do see differences in GSH levels between static and fluidic plates, and we see higher levels of GSH in the SciFlow plate than we do see in the static plate. So we do see increases in the ability for, the phase 2 GSH breakdown of or processing of drugs or toxicants. We see increases in the level of GSH in the fluidic plates as compared to the static plates. Thanks. Those are all great questions. I'm going to plow on and show some data. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Aflatoxin, same data set I showed at the start of the slide. Well, this is triplicate values, test compound in the source well, HEPA RGs plated in columns 3 through 11, siphon or waste all the way on the right side. We're dosing 1 time a day, and this is the experiment. It's a 4-day experiment. What we see is the highest concentrations of drugs are in column 3, nearest the source. The lowest concentration of aflatoxin is in column 11, farthest away from the source. This is a high content imaging experiment. We're looking at cell tox screen and HERP stain for determining the number of viable cells that are present. You can see we have high levels of viability at the start of the experiment. And then as we go through the experiment, the wells closest to the source, or the cells in the wells closest to the source, see the most rapid decrease in viability because they're exposed to the highest concentrations of aflatoxin. If we go across our plate to the downstream wells that see lower concentrations of drug, we're seeing higher viability, less cell death at the lower concentrations of drug that we see all the way on the right side or the far side of the plate. So this is an example of a direct effect. The concentration of drug is directly proportional to the cell effect that we're seeing, or the decrease in viability. Higher drug, lower viability, lower drug, higher viability. It's a direct effect, and it's a validation of the gradients and the utility of the gradients that we're generating across our plate. As I mentioned, this was a high-content imaging study. It was the Molecular Devices Image Express system. These are the images that are colorized that came directly out of the SciFlow plate in the Image Express system. The well that the data came from is circled. You can see at the beginning, there's a high number of viable cells. The blue one is Herc stain, or total. The pink is cell tox green, or the dead cells. Day 0, 20x image at about day 3, and then a 4x image all the way at the end of the experiment, where it's mostly dead cells with just a few viable cells that's still remaining. So we love doing high content imaging. We can do as many data points as we want. We can take the plate out of the incubator, pop it in the high content imager, do a quick read, put it back into the incubator until we want to do our next data point. It's very quick, very easy. You can generate a lot of data in a very rapid time frame. I also just want to mention that while I'm not showing it here, we also had a DMSO plate. We had a control plate. The control plate does not show this left to right bias. The control plate has very stable and reproducible levels of viable cells, and it's always in the 80 to 85% range of viable cells. So we're seeing very good cell viability across the course of the experiment with just the DMSO or vehicle treatment. Acetaminophen, quick acetaminophen. It was a 7 and a 9 day study that we did. These are 7 and 9 days post-drug treatment. The cells we work with have a 7-day establishment, or a 7-day period where you grow them without drug to allow them to fully express their metabolic competency and their CYP enzymes. So this is really more like a 14-day study that we're looking at, or a 16-day study. We're going to be looking at some cell titer glow and some microscopy work. This is day 7, cell titer glow. All these numbers are normalized to DMSO control. It's a comparison between static and fluidic. The fluidic is blue, the static is in red. And what we're seeing here is that the highest drug concentrations, because we did 2-fold dilutions in our static manually, at the highest drug concentrations, we see maybe a 20% decrease in viability at day 7 in our static plate. Similar at the second highest, or 2.5 millimolar concentration of acetaminophen in our static plate. And then beyond that, we basically return to 100%. We're not seeing any effects on the cells based on the treatment of acetaminophen in the static plate. The story in the SciFlow plate is very different. What we see in the SciFlow plate is we see a similar roughly 20% decrease in viability in the upstream well, but then we see a decrease downstream. So the highest drug concentration is not having the largest effect, but the downstream wells 4, 5, 6, are seeing much more potent effects than the highest concentration. We understand the mechanism of action of acetaminophen. We understand how acetaminophen works. It is a toxic metabolite. It is the accumulation of NAPQI and the depletion of GSH, which leads to downstream cell death. And that's exactly what we're seeing, metabolite flowing downstream. And then we see a dilution of that metabolite, so we see a recovery of the cells at the far end of the plate. We did this at day 7. We also did it at day 9. So looking at day 9, if we turn to our static again, 2 days later, we're finally seeing a potent effect in our static plate, the highest concentration. We see a middle response, the 2-fold dilution, and then we've lost most of our response in the static plate for the rest of the plate, in the static cultured cells for the rest of the plate. So all these dilutions didn't give us much information. Very interestingly, SciFlow, the effect has moved even slightly farther downstream. The cells have had a few more days to metabolize the acetaminophen, a few more days to generate the NAPQI, a few more days for the NAPQI to deplete the GSH and cause cell death. Whereas in day 7, we were seeing most of our effects in wells 4, 5, and 6. On day 9, it's going downstream to wells 6, 7, 8, 9, but then we do still see some dilution in wells 10 and 11 where we see some recovery. So what we're able to get from our SciFlow data, from our SciFlow plate, is we're able to get an understanding of metabolite effects or the mechanism of toxicity, and we're able to see that the flow is actually doing something to help us understand how the drug is working. We also were seeing effects much earlier. We were seeing effects at day 7, where it really took till day 9 or an extra day to see much of an effect at all in the static plate. Microscopy, images of the cells, DMSO control, acetaminophen. You can clearly see that at day 10, the drug-treated cells are really starting to look small and stressed out. And at day 14, the cells are really kind of dying, and you're not seeing much viable cells or many of larger cells that you see in the DMSO control. Also want to say cell titer glow mimics those effects. Cells are pretty happy day 3, day 7. Then in the acetaminophen, you see a rapid decline in ATP or cell titer glow at day 10, and then almost a total loss of ATP at day 14, where most of the cells are dead or at least extremely sick. Summary, the acetaminophen is a metabolite or a toxic metabolite effect, and the downstream cell death that we're seeing is a hallmark of that metabolite effect. Static cultures don't give quite as much information. Static cultures don't distinguish between direct effects and metabolite effects, and we see a good correlation between our cell titer glow data and our microscopy data. Chemotherapeutic panel, just to wrap up with one other example of how the system works. Oh, great question. Thank you. Was the metabolite concentration measured by LCMS? Yes, we did measure the metabolite concentration by LCMS. It does mirror what we were seeing with the cell death. We weren't able to detect NAPQI. If you have a good method of detecting NAPQI itself, I'd love to talk to you offline. But we were able to measure NAPQI GSH. So we were able to measure the breakdown or the detoxification of NAPQI. And that did titrate as we expected, with higher concentrations on the right side or downstream side of the plate and lower concentrations on the left or upstream side of the plate. Chemotherapeutic example, this was a quicker study. This was a 2-day study. We plated 2 different cell types, HEPA-RG again, or liver cells upstream, and we also tested primary rat hepatocytes upstream, and then downstream was MCF7 cells or breast cancer cells for looking for the effects of the chemotherapeutic, and it was a cell titer glow experiment where we generated the data. So how does it work? Just as an example, you don't have to put only 2 cell types. The data I'm going to show is only 2 cell types, but you can put 3 cell types if you wanted. You can put intestine, liver, or downstream organ. You could put more than 3 if you wanted. There's nothing magical about 2 or 3 different wells of a given cell type. It's going to take a little optimization, a little trial and error to determine how many different wells you need to be able to visualize or detect the effect that you're looking for. How did we do it? We had 3 different plates of cells in this experiment. Upstream cells in plate 1 were the liver or the HEPA-RG. The downstream were the MCF7 breast cancer cells. We then had 2 control plates, one that was just liver and one that was just MCF7 cell. I want to at this point highlight or at least mention that when we're culturing different cell types, one thing that we do is we can culture the cells in a smaller volume, in about a 50 microliter volume, and this leaves the cells all independent, or the wells all independent. At a 50 microliter volume, there is no flow between the wells, so we were able to establish the cultures with the liver cells in their media of choice and the MCF7 cells in their media of choice. And then when it was time to start the dosing, when it was time to start exposing the drug, we can either dump all the media and put them all into one standard media, or just begin the flow, and then we will get some mixing of media as the flow exists. But it allows us to establish the cultures and make sure the cultures are healthy in their own media before we mix them. On the bottom is the panel of 7 different drugs that we looked at. And what we're doing is we're flowing the drugs across the plate from left to right. And we're looking at the ability of the liver cells upstream to activate or bioactivate the drug. And then we're looking for the effect in this column, in column 7, on this column of cells directly downstream of our upstream liver. We could have looked in other wells as well, but this is where we began our examination, and this is what we were trying to see. So we're looking in this well for cellular effects based on the treatment of drug and the passage of drug through the liver cells. How does the data look? Again, this is cell titer glow data. It is normalized DMSO control. We've got 3 different data sets here. In blue is control 1, which is all liver cells. In red is control 2, which is all breast cancer cells. And in green is the combination of liver and breast cancer. The all liver control, it says, do these drugs work on liver cells? The answer is basically no. They're all safe drugs. They're all drugs that are on the market. The blue line is really pretty uniform across most of the plate. There's not a whole lot of effect of these drugs directly on liver cells. The breast cancer cells alone, by and large, again, these drugs need activation. Looking at just breast cancer cells, we're seeing pretty uniform concentrations for all the drugs across the whole plate. Dacarbazine is perhaps slightly anomalous. It does maybe show somewhat of an effect in the absence of the liver cells. But by and large, the rest of the drugs do require bioactivation. There's not a lot of cell killing or decrease in cell titer glow data based on the drug just being passaged through MCF7 cells. To get to the end, to get to the final story, the green bars, you can see for 5 of the 7 drugs, there's at least a 50% decrease in cell viability or decrease in cell titer glow data when those chemotherapeutics are first passaged through liver before they're exposed to the MCF7 cells. Probably the most dramatic effect is at metadienine, where we see a nearly total loss of cells downstream of the MCF, downstream of the HEPA-RG, whereas we saw almost no effect at all in the absence of the HEPA-RG. This drug really has a dramatic increase in efficacy when the drug is first passaged by the liver before it's exposed to the cells. And just a counterpoint, cyclophosphamide, almost no effect based on the presence or absence of the liver cells. We see almost an identical effect in just breast cancer or liver plus breast cancer. So we really can learn something about the drugs. We can monitor bioactivation or bioavailability of the drugs based on our little reconstituted system of liver upstream of MCF7. We then did it with some primary rat hepatocytes. I do want to first say we tested the primary rat hepatocytes were metabolically competent. They were expressing CYP3 enzymes, so we knew they could break down the drugs or bioactivate the drugs. But interestingly enough, we did not see the same effect. We saw very small, if any, increases in efficacy of the drugs when we passed them through the primary rat hepatocytes, as opposed to what we saw when we passed them through the human HEPA-RG cells. So it's an interesting story. It's an interesting way of saying these drugs really are more human-specific, and the biology is critical. And this type of information would have been lost on an animal in vivo study because the rat cells are not behaving in the same manner as the human cells are behaving. I've mentioned high-content imaging, just to kind of wrap it up. This is just 3 different images of 3 different high-content imaging dyes that we've worked with. I didn't show all this data in the talk. I just wanted to let people know we have worked with a handful of different high-content imaging dyes. We've worked with a handful of different high-content imagers. We've had good experiences with all the different systems that we've worked with. A little bit larger of a review or summary of some of the different assays that we've worked with. We've worked with a handful of kits from Promega, a handful of dyes, as I mentioned, a handful of plate readers, and a couple of different plate imagers just for testing the system and making sure our plate is compatible with all of the different systems that we've tested on the market. Oh, great question. On the chemotherapeutics, do you have data using human primary hepatocytes? Today, I do not. We do culture human primary hepatocytes. We can work with collagen monolayers and matrigel and things like that. That is a study that's on the books. I fully expect that we will do that study. We just don't have the data yet to share. But that would be the nice icing on the cake. That would really be the nice data set to have to demonstrate that the loss of effect that we saw in the primary rat study is a rat-mediated effect and not a primary effect. So thank you for reminding me we need to get to doing that study, but it's not been done yet. This data is all relatively recent data that we generated. Thank you for that question. So I mentioned before there's a couple of posters. I'm not sure if the posters are available on our website or not, but if you want to email myself or Steve, we're happy to send you electronic copies of these 2 posters that explain this data in a little bit more detail. Or if you want hard copies, we can send hard copies as well. I'm now going to turn it back over to Steve, who's going to talk a little bit about, can you repeat which media used in the source well experiment, HEPA-RG and MCF7? Oh, in the final experiment, when we did the coalesced media, that's a great question. I will need to get back to you on that question. I know that when we cultured them, and HEPA-RG, we use the media that comes directly from the manufacturer. For those cells, MCF7 was a pretty standard cell type, pretty standard media type that we used. I don't remember what the dosing media was that we put in there, but I can follow up with you on that question later on.
Sure.
Thanks for that question.
Yep. Thanks, Dave. I'm going to follow up with some business items. First off, I'm going to send everyone the webinar in PDF format. I'm going to send the 2 posters from SOT, so you will be getting an email from me. If you have any additional questions, please let me know. Most people ask about the pricing of the SciFlow 1000 system. It's 5 plates for $14.95. We have a starter pack. It's 5 plates, and then we include 2 extra, and we provide startup assistance with that. If you don't see your application, don't get discouraged. We're working with a lot of folks right now that are developing novel applications on the SciFlow 1000, and we would love to work with you. So if you buy a pack of plates, we will work with you to get things up and running. Or what you can do is we have a CRO internally. If you have a project, a proof of concept project, and you have a small budget, we would love to also get on that path. We have a distributor. For those of you in Europe, we work with Tibu, and you can get information off Tibu's website, or you can simply click on their website, contact us, and there's a list of salespeople that will help you out with our product. And I think that is about it. Thank you for your time. Again, we want to be respectful of the hour that we have. I want to thank everyone very much. If you want to have this webinar in a larger audience internally in your company, please let me know. We're happy to do that. We do it all the time. If you want to open it up to everyone else, we're more than happy to get on that path. And again, I'll be sending a follow-up. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.